Namaskar. Uh, we are very proud to have this talk by our own Pratik Patnaik ji, who's a young and scholarly Indic personality. Very rare to have such a young person uh, for such big tasks like covering the entire Odia literature. When you hear his introduction, you may get surprised that his background doesn't tell you that he is a person who could cover the entire history of Odia literature and introduce you to Odia literature. He is an independent researcher and Odissi classical musician. He is currently pursuing his master's in physics under Shikha Anusandhan, deemed to be University, Bhubaneswar, Odisha. He writes and delivers talks on the culture of Odisha, with special focus on the Jagannath temple tradition and traditional musical culture. For his groundbreaking field research and documentation of rare art forms of Odisha, and his specialized efforts in preserving ancient Odissi compositions from veteran gurus. He has received appreciation from various quarters, including the Chief Minister of Odisha. He has collaborated with several leading authorities in the sphere of culture. A practicing classical musician, he is a disciple of Pandit Guru Ramrao Patra and is currently continuing his higher training in Odissi vocal music as well as the Odissi Veena in the Shishya Parampara of the early 20th century maestro Acharya Tarini Charan Patra. So, with this background, you may get surprised that a master's in physics he is pursuing. He is towards the end of completing his master's in physics, uh, and his background is in classical music. But he is talking about Odisha literature, Odia literature. But here we have seen him having his penchant for talking about Odia literature. Not only that, it is nowadays very rare for us to have people with the perspective, Indic perspective, Indological perspective, Hindu perspective, Indic perspective towards any literature. That is one of the rare qualities that we found in him. And another thing is, I think you know that government of India a few years ago has given classical literature status, starting with originally, I think you must know that originally during the British time, there were two languages which were officially given the title or categorization of classical languages. They were Sanskrit and Persian. And then the Tamil literature scholars contested this, and they said Tamil is equally a classical language when you compare it to Sanskrit and Persian. And it was agreed at a certain stage, government of India agreed to give a classical language status to Tamil. And later, languages started claiming classical status for themselves. Telugu and Kannada were given, and then Malayalam and Odia were given. So now we have a very big number of Indian languages that are given classical language status. One of them is Odia also. And what is happening nowadays is that there are some Indologists who are saying that you are getting classical language status from government of India, but you do not have scholars in the classical aspects of those languages. Then recently I contacted Pratik ji and asked him whether classical language scholarship, classical literature scholarship of Odia is surviving and we can get enough number of scholars. he promised to me that he will get enough number of scholars of classical Odia. But it is, in fact, an unfortunate situation that in almost all Indian regional languages, because of the work of those scholars who blamed India for not having classical literature scholarship, they themselves are responsible for a gradual dwindling of classical literature scholarship. It is they who created a negative opinion about the classical stage of the history of any regional language literature in the minds of young scholars from a left liberal point of view. And it is they themselves again who are blaming these literatures for not having enough scholarship in classical literature. So these double standards are to be, they need to be exposed. And it is also a responsibility to preserve the classical scholarship in these literatures and how they are connected to the broad Indian literature ethos, how they preserve the broad Indic ethos is to be brought out. So, an Indic perspective of Indian regional literatures is the need of the hour, and we found that Pratik Patnaik, though is a very young person, though he works in classical music and classical dance and other areas of Odia culture, he is very much fit to talk about the classical literature and the other medieval and modern literatures of Odia. And I'm glad to share that he has decided to pursue literature studies after his master's in physics. That he told me he is going to pursue postgraduate studies in literature also. That will be a blessing for the Odia literature studies for people like Pratik to come into the mainstream literature scholarship. With this, I welcome Pratik to this talk, and I request Pratik to take over the dais and uh, introduce Odia literature from Indic perspective to the audience. Thank you very much, Pratik. Over to you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, sir. Uh, from the onset, I will clarify something that are generally confused. People are confused about. Odisha is the name of the state. The adjective form from the name of the state becomes Odissi, which refers to something from Odisha. That is the term that has been traditionally used with the music and dance primarily of the state. So performing arts. So we say Odissi music and Odissi dance for the traditional classical dance or the art, music or dance, what one can say. That is what is, we call that Odissi. And the language is called Odia. So I hope people will not get confused with these aspects later. The ancient names of Odisha as a land are, you must have heard Utkala as in the national anthem, Udra or Odra, Kalinga. These are the names of various locales, more or less 70% of today's Odisha and parts that have lied outside Odisha. The Odia language is spoken by roughly 35 million people, and it comes from Magadhi Prakrit. Some people say Ardha Magadhi Prakrit. And there is a version of it called Odra Prakrit, referring to the same Odra as in the name of the state. We are going to be talking about Odia literature primarily, but on the sidelines, we'll also come across directly or indirectly topics that deal with phonetics or the script of the language, and so on and so forth. So we'll deal with them in a lesser matter, emphasizing the literature for its own nature, not language primarily, but through the literature approaching the language. And Odia is spoken in the state of Odisha, of course, which was the first state to be formed on linguistic basis. What is also to be known is that Odia was also spoken in southern parts of what is present-day West Bengal. And primarily in the district of Medinipur, Odia was very widely spoken, and even the primary script was Odia script, in fact. In Jharkhand, what is now called Saraikela, the famous Chhau form, masked Chhau form, which is danced there, that is also from Odia culture, and it was an Odia place actually. Going from the, I'm calling it Odia, going by the ruling dynasty and the origin of the kingly dynasty and the general population. And that is now in Chhattisgarh. Areas of Jharkhand, bordering areas of Chhattisgarh, and South Odisha. If you look at South Odisha, almost the area, and including the Srikakulam district, until almost Vizag or so. Vizag, which is now called Vishakhapatnam, the original Odia name is Visakhapatna. It's become Patnam after going into Andhra. And similarly, the areas of Tarola, Monjusa, Tikili, these several areas were severed off from the state that was formed due to the politics of that time. But regardless of that, these are the belts where Odia language continues to be spoken hugely, although the demography is changing due to the change in the ruling. We will start with the beginning of Odia literature, as we know, is what is called the Charyapada in general Indian scholarship. So the Charyapada, or alternatively known as the Doha Kosha, they were a set of Buddhist tantric poems belonging to the Vajrayana sect of Buddhism, which, as we know, is a later development. The Vajrayana sect has begun in its initial stages as of the 5th century, we can say. The poems that are found, they are written by 84 acharyas of the Vajrayana Buddhism sect, who were known as the Mahasiddhas, or realized, those who had attained nirvana. So these 84 Mahasiddhas hailed from various parts of India, but they're mostly from Eastern India. Their biographies are retained in Tibetan, in that belt, in central Tibet, and all in their libraries, they preserve that. Regardless of that, so in the poems, the 84 Mahasiddhas, not all 84 have written, but some 40, 50 of them have written. In those poems, in certain poems, we find a heavy tendency towards Odia. So it is clearly discernibly Odia. And these songs were written, general scholarship calls them 8th to 10th century, dates them, but there are strains that can be dated to as early as the 5th century CE. So if we take roughly the period from 5th to 10th century, it will be more apt. Odia scholars have later found that the book, although generally has come to be known as the Charya Pada or Charya Giti, the book actually, in the Tika of that book, it calls Ascharya Charya Chaya Vinishchaya. So that is the proper name of that work. It is written in Prakrit, of course. It's not written in Sanskrit, but it has been, the commentary has been written in Sanskrit. So if we date this work to 5th to 10th century, certain acharyas, like for example, Kanhupa, Birupa, Sarahapa, these are the names ends with Pada, or which in Prakrit becomes Pa. So Kanhupa, that is the name of an acharya. So Sarahapa, that's how the names are there. In Odisha, even now we find villages that are named after these people. We find rivers that are named after these people. We find in public memory their names are retained. I'll come to why they are retained. So although the Buddhist Vajrayana Buddhism has faded away from Odisha around 11th, 12th century with Vaishnavism, when it becomes popular, this gradually dies away. These songs that we find them, even if they are written, you can say 5th to 10th, if we take an average 8th century, even if they're written some 1200 years ago, it is so understandable. Even today, if you go to the hearts, the tribal hearts or markets of Odisha, there will be people who can 100% understand it. Without, so that is to say that the Odia language has not changed that significantly, or has changed so little that it continues to be understandable even after a period of more than a millennium. So I'll give a sample. For example, Kanhupa writes in one of the charyas. These charyas are also one of the earliest songs because ragas have been delineated, and these ragas also we find in Odisha, they have survived in the Odia tradition. So for example, Kanhupa writes, Aliye Kaliye Bato Rundhela. Now, for example, the form Rundhela, this is something that we say in Odia even now. We say Rundhila in present day Odia. So the only thing that has changed in this line is the ekara becomes an ikara. The ekara is still found in some dialects of Odia. So it's so understandable. Ta dekhi kanhu bimana bhoila. This in present day Odia, it becomes ta dekhi kanhu bimana hoila. So again, only one letter has changed. So these forms that we find, the Rundhila, Bhonila, Aila, these forms are completely, they show greater affinity with Odia than with Bengali or Ahamiya. There are other songs which show greater affinity with Bengali and Ahamiya too. But the majority of the work remains closely allied with the present day Odia language, especially the Odia language that is the archaic Odia language that is spoken by the tribals of South Odisha. It finds more affinity with that. In the biographies or the hagiographies, whatever we might call them, of the acharyas that are preserved in Tibet, it identifies mostly with southern Odisha tribal belts. So that is one point. This is the Ascharya Charya Vinishya. This belongs to the Vajrayana Buddhism sect associated with Tantrism and Yoga. Later, of course, we find almost no clue about what was written in the 11th century, but inscriptional evidence comes to help. As inscriptions have been issued by various kings, from the 10th century onwards, we find very clear Odia lines in the inscriptions. Perhaps there is older evidence, we have not come across it. And we find complete Odia inscriptions issued from 11th, 12th century, whole inscription. So the point is to state that kings used to encourage the local language, not just Sanskrit. Kings such as Langula Narasimhadevo, who constructed the Jagannatha, who constructed the Konark Sun Temple, and Anantavarma Chodagangadeva, who initiated the construction of the Jagannatha Temple of Puri, they used to encourage scholarship and literature in the regional Prakrit languages. Now, this is the same period we find the temple chronicle of the Jagannatha temple. We find it retains, it is 3 or 4 parts. One part deals with what are the rituals to be conducted for Lord Jagannatha. So it's properly mentioned. So in the morning you do this, or the yearly calendar is mentioned, that all is there, which is roughly unchanged from at least over 1000 years, clearly, as in any other Indian ancient Pitha. Other part of the Madala Panji, it is called Madala Panji because Panji is a chronicle and palm leaf manuscript was the primary mode of keeping literature in Odisha. It is theorized that the Odia script became rounded due to the tendency of writing on palm leaf manuscript, inscribing palm leaf manuscript. The leaf tears if the strokes are not curved. If there are straight strokes, then the leaf tears. Therefore, it adapted, becoming more rounded in nature, is what scholars believe. So this Madala Panji has another section which talks about the kings, and in that Panji, the Panji itself mentions that Chodaganga Devo, who is the builder of the present day Jagannatha temple, there was a temple before that. So, and the major propagator of the Eastern Ganga dynasty, established the dynasty. He came from the southern parts of Odisha and ruled overthrew the Keshari dynasty that preceded him. So if I may, I will give an instance. The Panji says that Chodaganga Deva ordered for the Panji to be written. So he ordered that a chronicle be maintained. But later scholarship, some scholars believe in its favor that it contains the substrate at least belongs to 11th century. However, there has been some controversy in this matter, and later scholars have claimed that if the Jagannath temple, it was attacked so many times, and it is not realistic to expect that an 11th century manuscript will be pre-retained. Now, other scholars have countered, saying that there were always multiple copies or backups kept in the temple. So therefore, we cannot deny it is like the Vedas. The Vedas, some parts of the Vedas can be dated to be much older than other parts. It is just like that. We can't deny that there is nothing from 11th century. Some substrate or some portions are clearly older. So therefore, the Madala Panji is considered one of the oldest books or chronicles of Odia literature. It maintains Odia prose. So I will just quote a story from the Madala Panji. It recounts the legend of how Chodaganga Deva came to be the ruler. It says that a Brahmana by the name of Basu, He was given a village by the last Keshari ruler, and that Keshari ruler also gave that village in the name of some Pathan. It uses the word Pathan for Muslim. So the Brahmin came and told, and the king was he was not interested. You deal the matters. He said something, and the Brahmin was offended. Therefore, he went southwards, and he received a dream from Lord Lingaraja of Bhubaneswar town that there is a boy named Chodaganga in South Odisha. You go there, you will find him. So he goes southward. He finds this boy playing with his mates, and in that game, he is acting as the king. He tells, "No, you come with me. Lord Lingaraja has ordered that you will go, and you have greater things in your destiny." So Chodaganga goes to his mother and tells, "Mother, there is this Brahmin lord who's telling like this. So should I go?" So she tells that I have a friend by the name of Nitei Dhobani. Dhobani refers to washerwoman. I have a friend by the name Nitei Ma, and she's elderly to me. She's like a older sister. You go and you ask her. If she tells yes, then you go. So he goes to Nitei Dhobani. Now this Nitei Dhobani is she is skilled in the tantric art. So you see this state, this tantric state, somehow somewhere Buddhist, somewhere associated with the Natha cult, somewhere Shaiva, but no matter what, it always appears. So Nitei Dhobani is apparently cooking her own leg on a stove, and she has lit fire to her own leg, and she's making a broth or something. So young Chodaganga is taken aback, but he's not afraid. So that is one of the early markers that he is going to be king. Now, Nitei Dhobani says, "I have magical bananas in my grove. You go and eat." He goes and he eats. And how many have you eaten? I have eaten 18. Okay, you go. She teaches him some things. Now the story is that Chodaganga comes and he creates a magical rain of all bodily wastes, and the Keshari rulers try everything to stop it, but they cannot because he is so powerful. Tantric things he knows. Therefore, they are forced to leave, and Chodaganga becomes the overlord. Now, this story preserves an aspect of the tantric culture of then Odisha with the deity of Nitei Dhobani as well as Chodaganga. Nitei Dhobani is the tantric guru of Chodaganga Deva, and there were 7 tantric sisters in around that same time, 10th, 11th century Odisha, who were until this date, if you look at the local, what is called Garudi literature or the folk tantra literature, when there is a snake bite or when there is poison in somebody's body, when somebody faints due to fits or something, earlier they used to do that desi colloquial tantric upachara, which is frowned upon by the elite people, but it is very much extant. And that literature is certainly can be dated to 10th, 11th century because it finds mention of these very names. It says, "In the name of Nitei Dhobani, I challenge the ghost to remain in the body. So you have to leave if her name is taken." So that is the culture of then Odisha. And we have other songs like Donda Nacho or Ghoda Nacho. These songs that have been preserved in the oral literature are certainly and unanimously dated to some time in the that 11th, 12th, that period. So that was a brief introduction to Madala Panji and the associated tantric body of oral literature that is documented but not often talked upon. We will come back to this after an intermission because here comes Kaviraja Jayadeva, who writes the Gita Govinda. What many people don't know is that, of course, he was born in Kenduli Sasana on the banks of the Prachi river, which is considered to be the elder sister of Ganga herself in Odisha. On the banks of the Prachi river, there is a village called Kenduli, which Jayadeva calls Kendu Bilwa in Sanskrit. It's full of Kendu and Bilwa trees. That is why the name. And in that village, worshipping Madhava deity, Madhavananda Jew of Niyali village, Jayadeva wrote his Gita Govinda. In the Puri, there is a Dashavatara Matha, there he wrote. So, of course, in the Gita Govinda itself, we find internal evidence of his heavy inclination towards the Odia pronunciation. As we know, Sanskrit has no standard script or it has no standard pronunciation either. Nowadays, we see the northern India pronunciation taking over greatly because of the wider coverage assigned to it by the media. However, in eastern part of India, at least in Odisha, all the Sanskrit manuscripts that we find are written in Odia script. And there is a local pravidhi of Ucharana as well, as is in in other parts of India. For example, in Tamil Nadu also we find them calling Maga Ganapati, etc. In Odisha, similarly, we find the retroflex sound Ada. So in the Rig Veda, like Agni Mile Purohitam, that Ada sound is retained in Odia. Another feature of Odia language that is at least from that 5th, 8th century is that all the three shas are pronounced in the Dantya version. So we will say Syama, we will not say Shyama. In Bengali, we see an inclination towards the Talavya sound. In Odia, we find an inclination towards the Dantya sound. So much so that even when manuscripts are identified, this is taken as a recognizing feature of where that manuscript hails from. So whereas the sha, sa, sa, that might be Deshiya Acharana, the usage of the retroflex sounds, ada, 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 these things are very much in affirmation with Sanskrit grammar, and Sanskrit grammar also allows that it can be used. You can say Agni Mile, you can say Agni Mide. These local variations have existed from time immemorial. In the Gita Govinda, we find the affinity towards the retroflex sound ada and ada and ada, obviously. The proof of that is if you see the rhythmic patterns of the Gita Govinda and the sonic patterns. For example, in the second song, he says, Srita Kamala Kucha Mandala He Dhruta Kundala He Kalita Lalita Vanamala. So you see this la sound is recurring. In North India or South India, they will pronounce this as Kalita Lalita Vanamala. There something very essential to the Atma of the Gita Govinda is lost, because the poet is writing in this flavor of Sanskrit, which is not to be found elsewhere. So this is also an influence of Sanskrit. We also find words in the Gita Govinda that are very typical Odia words. So he's transposing them. Similarly, in the third song, we find Lalita Labanga Lata Parishilana Komala Malaya Samire. So again, this ada, ada, ada. A rarer fact is that Jayadeva has written songs in Odia as well. And the language that we find is, it sounds archaic and it deals with topics that are very much in line with the thinking pattern of the Gita Govinda. For example, he says, Sarasa Vasanta Ghana Jamuna Tatavi Punya Nipataru Mule Vijay Nanda Nanda. So again, he's talking about Krishna and Radha. And when Jayadeva introduces the character of Radha, it becomes so popular, and Krishna culture and mostly Vaishnava culture, because he says Rama, Balarama, Buddha, Kalki. He doesn't identify Krishna as an avatar. He calls Krishna to Bhagavan Swayam, and Dashakriti Kriti Krishna to, he says Dashakriti Kriti Krishna Yatubhyang Namah. That's what he says. So he doesn't identify Krishna as an avatar, rather as avatari. So this catches on. After this, there is a huge increase in Krishna literature. However, in 13th, 14th century, we find few Odissi songs, that is the classical Prabandha, what we say. The counterpart word for it in the north is Bandish. Prakrishta Rupena Bandha iti Prabandha. So they wrote very specifically musical compositions. We find compositions of Gajapati Ananga Bhima Deva from 13th century, which are still sung. And he properly mentions that the king of Purushottama, so Puri, so there is no doubt about identification. That is one point. We talked about inscription. Now coming to 13th, 14th century, we find a scarcity of literature from that period. So some people call it the dark period. However, we find a major piece of literature from this period, which is called the Sisu Veda. This Sisu Veda is so important that in later literature, it is called the Panchama Veda itself. It is called the essence of the four Vedas. This is important because Atharva Veda, the Paipalada Shakha was not found for a long time. Sometime in the 80s, 70s, it was a huge chunk was found in Odisha. So later they began surmising that this Atharva Veda practice has some link with Odisha, and Atharva Veda also this folk tantra, this evidence and its importance given to it, all that indicates indirectly to Odisha. So Atharva Veda, and now we find that same traits coming back in a book called Sisu Veda. The language of the Sisu Veda, something I will recount from it. So it says, now this is what we will call Natha literature. Natha literature identifies as the Adinatha, they identify Shiva himself. So it is associated with Shiva, and later with Gorekhanatha, Goraksha, who is worshipped all across India in Gujarat, Punjab, Rajasthan, Bengal, Odisha, wherever you go, Rekhanatha shrines are there. Where he hailed from is a point of dispute. However, the Goraksha Samhita that is found, manuscripts are found and have been critically edited. It has the same tendency, the usage of pa instead of va, usage of ra, this manuscript show. So it points towards Eastern India. And in some belts of northern India, there is a belief that Gorekhanatha was from Odisha because they quote lines in Odia. So the Sisu Veda is believed to be written by Gorekhanatha, the mystical Gorekhanatha with whom lots of legends are associated. That is a different topic. The language, I will quote a line. Eke eke nuhoi dui laga bilaga nirohu nirantare sehu alag. Sisumuna madhe mati prakasa volamti gorekhanatha e gyaninkara vishwasa. So these are the origins of the Hatha Yoga stream also. This language, as in the Charjapada, is called Sandhya Bhasha. So language which can be interpreted, if interpreted well, it is bright as day or dark as the night. So therefore, the middle transition period or Sandhya period, that's how. So, and the Sisumuna, the Chalana of the winds, Ida Pingala Sushumna, and that Hangsa, all these concepts come around. And these concepts also most probably developed in Eastern India. That's what Hatha Yoga scholarship also says. So that is the Sisu Veda. This is also called Gorekha Samhita. We find other books called Amara Kosa, and we find a commentary on the Sisu Veda by a lady who calls herself Dombi Mata, the mother of the Domba tribe, matriarch of the Domba tribe. Now this Domba tribe is heavily associated with Odisha because Odisha is a hotbed of all kinds of Adivasi populations. There are a lot of Banavasi populations in the Koraput district. So that's another link. That is what the 13th, 14th century literature was more or less obsessed with the Natha and the yogic streams, much like the Charya Gitis. From the late 14th century and the early 15th century, we find compositions that are called Chautisa. Now, this Chautisa is a kind of long song in which there are 34 stanzas, each for the 34 letters of the alphabet. Songs of this type have also been located by the Mahasiddha composers of the 8th century. This is also very clearly associated with either the puja paddhatis or the hatha yogic streams, because both in the yoga they establish the 34 aksharas or the matrikas of the Indian alphabet from ka to ksha. They establish in various parts, various chakras of the body. And also in the puja paddhati, for example, in the puja paddhati of Lord Jagannatha, you have they will do kang namaha, like that they will do until ksha, and they have that viparita also. So they'll come backwards. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudeva, Yavade Subad, that opposite to rendition is also there. So it's not just about the meaning, it's also about the letters themselves are Brahma. So from that mindset, this Chautisa genre comes about, where Ka to Ksha, 34 consonants, 34 stanzas are written. One of the earliest Chautisa that is written is in 15th century by one man called Bacha Dasa, who writes a Shaivite poem. So we find the Shiva evidence. Temples were also greatly constructed for Shiva preceding 11th, 12th century. Then after that we find more and more Vishnu temples. Not to say there were no Vishnu temples before 11th century, but it was dominantly Shiva because the ruling class was Shiva. And after Chodaganga Deva converted to Vaishnavism, there was a huge increase in Vaishnavism. Jagannatha continued to be the state deity even before Vaishnavism. So he was identified with Adi Buddha, and before that he was identified as the Jaina lord, as in the times of the ruler Kharaveda. So that's a lot of things to say. But Jagannatha, irrespective of the sect of Hinduism, was identified as the state deity for longer than we know. Now, this Kolosa Chautisa, which is one of the earliest of the Chautisa class, is surprisingly a satire on the marriage of Shiva and Parvati. And it is Parvati Sakhis are telling to Parvati that your parents are getting married to this old man, and they don't care in the least about you, and that's how he's always coughing and he has an old bull. And, that's the kind of man you are getting married to. So don't get too happy. It is surprising to find something of this nature in 15th century, not caring about what people will think about their Lord being challenged, and also reflects the open tendency of the people in dealing with their deities as if they are friends. The tune Kalasa Chautisa, Kalasa referring to Kalasa, this tune continued into later day Odia and Odissi music known as Kalasa Bani, the tune of the Kalasa. Now, this Kalasa Bani was considered so auspicious, it is a must in marriages and other Mangalya rituals. The tune goes like কহন্তি কামেনি শুণ হেমন্ত দুলণী কাহু বরে বরিলে তুমর পিতামণি কুল পুত্র আদি নাই জান তার কনক বেদিরে বুঢ়া বসিছি মজর. These kinds of songs that deal with regular lifestyle of the normal people, even in today's marriages, they have this kind of song called Vibhagara or Mangala Gita. It is a custom to go and to tell the bride that the groom is it's an old man you are ruining your life, and vice versa. So that is being transposed to the deity in this song. So reflecting folk customs of that period. This was the origin of the little bit of Shaivite literature, whatever we find remaining. We also find another work called Kesava Koili, in which written by one Markonda Dasa, same early 15th century or late 14th century, in which Yashoda is telling to Krishna that Yashoda is telling to a cuckoo, "Oh Koili, my Krishna has gone." So that is Vatsalya sentiment we find. This song is so popular that even in the belts of Odisha that have been taken to Andhra Pradesh and so on, even among the tribal population that are greatly illiterate, even their mothers sing this song. Koili kesava je mathura ku gola কাহা বলে গলা পুত্র বাহুড়ি নইলালো কেশব যে মথুরা কুগলা. This is one of the earliest songs that is known irrespective of the hillocks or the general village public, farmers or kings, everybody knows this song. This is one of the earliest songs that we have retained in oral memory, so to say. The tunes are definitely older than that because they reflect a refinement that are not to be called primitive. It can't be called primitive. It is very classical in that sense. Literature of this period is primarily Padya. We find prose literature from the Madala Panji, which is one of the earliest, but we find prose literature is very rare. It is more poetry and there's no recitation, of course, so it becomes song. Now, in the rule of the king Kapilendra Deva, the Ganga Vangsha was until now the Eastern Ganga dynasty was there, Chodaganga Deva, Narasingha Deva, and all that. From the 15th century, we find Surya Vangsha taking over. Surya Vangsha, the first king is Kapilendra Deva, who is known as Kapila in local oral memory of Odia people. Kapilendra Deva has written a Vyayoga, a Sanskrit Nataka, in which he uses certain Odia songs through the character of Parshurama himself. So we find that there is a thriving Nataka culture or a play culture is surviving in that period. And he has indicated ragas, of course, for the songs. So he says, Kebana Muni Kumara Parasu Dakshina Kara Bamena Sohe Dhanusarna. The typical colloquial Odia, heavy dose of Deshaja words and shying away from Tatsama words, although Tatsama words are there, prefers to use the Deshaja words. Similarly, in line with the earlier literature what has come upon. In the period of Kapilendra Deva, there is a marvelous man by the name of Sarala Dasa, who is a farmer by profession. And he says, by the grace of the goddess Sarala Chandi of the village Jhankada, who is traditionally identified as Saraswati of Odisha. So he says that goddess is telling, she's sitting on my head and she's telling me, I am a fool, I am a farmer, I am illiterate, I don't know. Whatever she's telling me, I'm writing. This man has written an outstanding translation or rather transcreation of the entire 18 kandas of the Mahabharata, parvas of the Mahabharata. And what he does is he changes the order of the parvas at times. He renames them, more or less retains the storyline, but changes it drastically, including new stories that are local stories of Odisha, and changing the structure and everything. So it can't be called a translation. It's a transcreation is the word that is used. The stories that he tells, the stories are very much from the oral culture again, and he is the first one who is bringing this to writing. It was there in the oral culture. He is codifying it in a certain manner. So he talks about Babana Bhuto, who is a ghost character, which mothers in Odisha use to pacify their children, that "Oh, ghost is there, you sleep." So that character he introduces as a formal character in the Mahabharata storyline. He also introduces new stories, as I was telling, as in the story of Duryodhana crossing the river of blood. So Duryodhana sees there's a river of blood after the war, and he crosses the river. How to cross? So there are corpses floating on it. He uses one corpse as his boat and he crosses, only to find that the corpse is of his own son. So that is the karma phala of him. These are his innovations. And Sarala also talks about the Vishnu's avatar of Navagunjara, which is a composite animal of 9 creatures which Arjuna comes across and is shocked to find a divinity in a creature that he's never encountered before. Thinks, what is this? This might be a ghost, or it might be a demon, or is this something evil? But there is Krishna's hand with the chakra. So he identifies that what is beyond my understanding is a sign of divinity, not something to be afraid of. So that Navagunjara we find greatly. We also find songs called Baramasi, which is Baramasi you find in North India as well. Again, part of oral literature, as we were talking about Mangala Gita, the songs of marriage, Kandana Gita, the songs which the women sing when they are going away from the father's house. So these all are literature written by women, important in that regard. They talk about the house, they talk about aspects that literature written by men will never refer. They don't talk about war or royalty or politics. They don't talk about that. They talk about family dynamics and father selling off daughter for dowry, all that. And we see Baramasi songs. So that is, we have reached 15th century, which is a great transition, because now after Sarala Dasa's Mahabharata, we find 5 saint poets coming who identify themselves as Pancha Sakha. They work together. They claim Jagannatha as their all in all. So they identify that our guru's guru is also Jagannatha. Our whole Lord is Jagannatha. The whole thing is centered around Jagannatha Puri. So they are reviving they're enriching the cult of Jagannath, culture of Jagannatha in Puri in certain way. These 5 friends lived around 14th, 15th century. Their names are Matta Balarama Dasa, Atibodi Jagannatha Dasa, Achyutananda Dasa, Jasovanta Dasa, and Sishu Ananta Dasa. And what they are doing is they are collecting remnants of whatever the yogic beliefs, the practical sadhanas of Odisha, whatever the Brahma Vidya, whatever was remaining, they are collecting those and collating those and putting that in proper Vaishnavite frame. They're codifying it. And when they're codifying it, they're giving a distinct identity to Utkaliya Vaishnavism, what is called, how it differs from other streams. And when Chaitanya comes down to Odisha, he has long discourses and debates with these 5 friends, and they counter him on various regards. For example, Chaitanya says the Mahamantra is Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. But Ativadi Jagannath Das and the Pancha Sakha tell that no, Hare Rama, Hare Rama. That Rama comes first, then comes Krishna. That is, Utkaliya stream has retained that. So Chaitanya argues, then he agrees that whatever is in the temple of Lord Jagannatha, that stream must have some basis to it. We can't argue with it. So they have these arguments. These Panchasakha are notable in that they have done very much ground research and have collected and put to writing in proper yogic sadhana streams, although in encoded language so that the normal person doesn't get confused. They have something for the sadhaka who leaves the house. They have something for the householder. And they are telling very typical yogic sadhanas that we used to find in the Charyapada, that Natha. For example, they are telling Hongsa, that is the shwasa that is going in, coming out, that is always telling Hangsa so hung. Therefore, you don't need to utter any mantra. You just meditate on the breath and you will attain the vision of Brahma. These kinds of things they keep telling. And we find there also social warriors in that sense of the word. For example, Matta Balarama Dasa, the eldest of the Pancha Sakha, he writes a Purana called Lakshmi Purana, in which the story is that in the month of Margashira, on Guruvara, Thursday, it is Lakshmi's day. Therefore, people across Odisha worship Lakshmi. So, a Chandaluni from the streets is worship from the Chandala Sahi, from the outcast street, is worshipping Lakshmi. So, Lakshmi is out on an early morning walk on a Thursday, and she goes and she enters the house of the Chandaluni. Impressed, she gives her all boons and everything. When she returns, Jagannatha's elder brother, Balabhadra, that you have gone to the house of an untouchable and you can't enter this temple after this. Now Jagannatha tries to plead, but elder brother won't agree. So therefore Lakshmi has to leave the house. So she leaves all the wealth and everything and she leaves. When she leaves and goes to her father, then all wealth and all food disappears from the Puri temple. So now these two brothers, although they have retained their caste and everything, they don't have anything to eat because Mahalakshmi herself has left. Therefore, they go around roaming the streets and they become beggars because they are Brahmins. Therefore, they recite the Vedas and they take offerings. But whenever they take rice, rice also disappears because Pavana Devata is subservient to Lakshmi. She tells you, dry away all their food and don't give them water and all that. So the point is established in the end when Jagannatha's elder brother, Balabhadra, says that now I have to survive, I have to eat to survive. I don't care whether the caste goes or whatever happens. So he goes and he finds a house, dilapidated house, which is identified by the local people as house of a Chandaluni. And inside he eats the food. He says, I don't care if it is made by a Chandaluni, I have to survive. He eats the food and he says that this is my Bahu's cooking. I can recognize the taste. And Lakshmi comes out and says, since you called me Chandaluni, therefore I have been identifying myself as Chandaluni. The point of the whole story is that there is nothing as touchable or untouchable within the precincts of the Puri temple. So therefore, even to this date, Mahaprasada, it is said that even from the mouth of a dog, the gods are looking forward to eat the Mahaprasada because that is the value Brahma Padartha. And this story establishes the social dynamics of that period. Balarama Dasa also talks about how he was outcast by the Brahmins of the Mukti Mandapa of that period for reciting the Vedas, but he becomes capable due to divine skill and he's able to recite the Vedas. More, the point being that God is accessible to all workers. And this also hails back to the same, because Tantra was also saying the same thing. That, so it's like a wave movement towards codification and breaking away from the same codification. It's a movement of that kind. The Pancha Sakha movement has people from all the four Varnas. So there is a Atibadi Jagannatha Das hails from the Brahmin class. He has written the transcreation of the Sanskrit Bhagavata in Odia because his mother was unable to understand the Sanskrit Bhagavata. Now this Bhagavata is typically recited in Odia as Govinda, 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 Podu Godu Chema Koranda, Sema Koranda, Panakari, Hele Torile Broja Nari, Se Broja Narinko Poyore, Monamo Rahu Nirantare, Monamo Nirantare Rahu. Krishna Boli Jivo Jau. This is the traditional mode of recitation in the typical and unique Adatadi of our Odissi music stream. And this recitation style or singing style becomes very popular, and Bhagavata gharas or tungis are established across Odisha because normal people are now interested to listen to the tales of Krishna because they can understand it for the first time. They are not barred from listening to the Sanskrit. Similarly, Balarama Dasa translates the entire Ramayana there, adding his own things and identifying it with the local geography of Odisha, making it more relatable for the local people. And Balarama Dasa's Ramayana, which is called Jagamohana Ramayana or Dandi Ramayana, that Ramayana is the first where the tale of Shabari comes. So Rama accepting offerings from, again, tribal lady. We see this pattern here in his writings. Achyutananda Dasa, Jasavanta Dasa, and Sisu Ananta Dasa, the other three members of the famed Pancha Sakha. They talk about yantra, mantra, and yoga worship methods, traditional, both classical as well as folk. They give that. They also write literature for the cowherds. They write literature for the fishermen and fisher folk. And they're more interested in amalgamating and unifying the community and not allowing it to break away in light of whatever their political scenario was in that period. This same period was also the Bhakta Raghu Arakita, who drank poison in the name of Lord Jagannath, who happens to be our Kula Guru. And that was the period of the Pancha Sakha. This is the Pancha Sakha age where knowledge is democratized, translated into the Prakrit, and newer stories are introduced. Folk beliefs are sanctioned, not excluded, and included along with Shastric knowledge, which is also dispersed to the public. After this, in the 16th century onwards, we find more and more affinity towards writing kavyas. Kavyas in the model, same like Meghadutam and all. Kavyas that are intended to exhibit literary mastery, what we present day identify as more classical or rigorous, the tendency towards that, and all kinds of literary effects, sonic effects, anuprasa, yamaka, all that. And the earlier period kavyas, we find Sisu Sankara, Usabhidasa, we find Dinakrishna Dasa writing his Rasa Kallola. And we also find this affinity towards greater music. Earlier music was intended for message, communicating the message of Brahma. This music is intended just for the sake of music. So that's how. And in also in musical literature, we find samples given which are in pure Odia language. And to give you samples of 16th century, for example, the writing of Dinakrishna Dasa. He says there is no other Lord other than Jagannath. Dinakrishna Das was famously called by the Gajapati king of Puri and was ordered to write poems in the king's name, and he refused, for which he was put into the prison. He said, "My only Lord is Jagannath." And he sings this song that Jagabandhu Parijane Samanta Nahi Nahi. So there is no other like my Jagannath. জগবন্ধু পরিজনে সামন্ত নাহি নাহি তো চৌদ ভুবন বারতা জানন্তি চক্রে ছেদন্তি আরত নাহি নাহি তো. These kinds of writings we find increasingly. And what the Pancha Sakha had made popular, articulating more and more the love for Jagannath. I'll quote one more line from the Pancha Sakha, which is that Balarama Dasa from the Pancha Sakha is famously known to have built chariots out of sand, because he goes to climb the chariot and he's thrown off the chariot because he's ashuchi, is what the Pandas believe. So he goes to the seashore and he makes 3 chariots out of sand. And he tells Jagannatha, "Where will you go? You have to come to me. You can't leave without me." He says with that kind of confidence and arrogance in a way. Arrogance fit of a bhakta. So that time he's written songs. He says, "Kemonte kari se chalibo ratha, mubandi karichi Sri Jagannath." I have made Jagannatha bandi in the prison of my heart. Therefore you can't leave. This is also an example of 15th century Odia literature was so closely linked with Jagannatha that was the kind of language, local, colloquial, casual language in use with the deity. And we come with this elaborate literature in the 16th century. Some famous works are Sisu Shankara's Usa Bhidasa, Parimala by Narasingha Sena, Rukmini Vibha by Kartika Dasa, so on and so forth. There are dozens like this. And they also reflect music and language and all that, but we don't have time for that. We find a later stage, this literature belongs to the musical group of what is called Chanda, songs that are set to a definite Chanda and Raga and Tala. These tunes are one of the oldest tunes. We find both tunes that are set to Tala called Anibaddha and tunes that are not, tunes that are set to Tala Nibaddha, not set to Tala Anibaddha. We find both these kinds of singing in this chanda. They are primarily long ballad-like songs with fixed traditional tunes that have been codified and are consistently found across entire Odisha, starting from Medinipur area to Srikakulam district. There is no dispute regarding either the tune or the tala or anything. So that is how consistent and rooted these tunes are. From the 17th century, we find a maestro by the name of Kavi Samrat. This epithet was given later. He belonged to the ruling family of Bomusara estate, Bhanja family. His name was Upendra Bhanja. He was a Siddha in the Ramatarak. So Upendra Bhanja, belonging to a family of musicians and literature exponents, writes what is known as the Vaidehisa Bilasa, Lavanyavati, Koti Brahmanda Sundari. These are works or kavyas, of which his magnum opus is the Vaidehisa Bilasa, in which he demonstrates that Odia language can do whatever Sanskrit can do. So all kinds of yamakas and anuprasas and shabda alankara, artha alankara, whatever is there, he takes it to the extreme. There is nobody who can surpass that. So Upendra Bhanja, for example, will write, Vicharoi malo jomo kore kavi mone, bule rama 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 netri gheni bone je, bruhad bhanu 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 prabhat. One word coming there. Bruhad bhanu 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 prabhat. Bruta tamalo malo malati lata johije. So this is mala jamaka. Similarly, we find he will write one stanza, it will have 21 meanings. So is written, for example, বন্ধই দিন বান্ধব যে তম চক্র খণ্ডনকারী সদা কমলানন্দ বিস্তারী স্বভাবে যে. This one line can be, and other lines of this song can be interpreted in light of Vishnu, Shiva, Surya, Jagannatha, Rama, Krishna. It is still a matter of dispute whether there are more ways of interpretation remaining that present scholarship can't do, because it's just not as qualified. So that is Bhanjo. In music also he does the same. He illustrates elaborate structures as well as illustrating simple structures. In a way, he provides the template for all people who are coming later. He provides at least one model of each type, and that model is the epitome of what can be done in that genre. This poet brings excellence to the Chanda genre. He also popularizes what is the Kshudra Gita, or the what is presently called the general Odissi Prabandha song, which is a small song of 4 lines, so Chatushpadi, in line with Jayadeva's Ashtapadi. He makes that popular. He also writes simple songs such as Moli Malo Syamo Devi Mono Toshibi Moli Malo Syamo. I will give a jasmine garland to Shyama. If it is hot, I will wipe off the sweat from his brow. So Madhurya Bhakti is what we find. We must remember that these poets were not just writers, they were Vaggayakaras. So they composed the songs, they set it to the Tala and Raga. And Bhanja is a huge chapter. If we keep talking about him, it will not end. He indulges in so much rich bhava things that it is not possible to exhaust his literature. Just after Bhanja, we find increase in the number of Ramayanas that are written. We find Rama cult is very popular in Odisha as of 17th century, which is a big thing to say, because Chaitanya has already arrived and one should expect Krishna to be more popular. But Rama's popularity continues from the 12th century onwards, and it is not seen to be fading in any way. Some people keep saying that Rama cult doesn't find enough mention, but in Odisha literature we find a complete opposite. We find it is more Rama as of 17th century. In towards the end of the 17th century, we find poets belonging to the more allied towards the Krishna sect. Irrespective of all this, Jagannatha continues to be at the center, which is typical feature of Odisha from the beginning. For example, the poet Vanamali Dasa of Puri, one of the prominent, if we say the trinity of composing Odissi songs or Odia literature, which was small Kshudra Gita Prabandhas, which was dominant in 17th, 18th, 19th century. We find 3 poets, the first of them being Vanamali Dasa of Puri town. So he, for example, writes songs like Jagannath ho kichi magu nahi তোতে জগন্নাথ ধন মাগু নাহি জন মাগু নাহি মাগুছি সরধা বালিরু হাতে জগন্নাথ. The meaning being, Jagannatha, nothing do I ask from you. I don't ask for wealth or I don't ask for family. The only thing I ask for is a fistful of sand from your Bodadanda, the road outside the Puri temple, the road on which Jagannatha comes and walks and goes during Ratha Jatra. So he wants a fistful of sand is all he wants. Some around this Bonamari was around 1720 he was born. Bonamari Dasa, we call him Bhakta Kavi Bonamari Dasa. Around 1760-70, we find poet from southern Odisha, stronghold, Madala Panji, known from the Gandharva arts. We find Kavi Kalahansa Gopal Krishna Patnaik. Now, Gopal Krishna also very much devoted to Krishna, but his songs have a different poignant flavor to them, is what we can say. He is not interested in general descriptions and elaborate what usually poets do and yamaka and effects and all. He's not at all interested in that. He's only interested in Madhurya Bhakti. So he writes songs such as Vatsalya songs. He writes Shama Pabada Mute Lagithau Are Pranosoy. Gopala Krishna's Radha says that let the kalanka of Shyama's name be on my forehead. So other poets, Radhas, are telling that what this Krishna has done, I have been, there is so much kalanka in my name. Everybody on the streets is just ignoring me, scolding me. But Gopal Krishna's Radha is so bold. And she is telling that let this blot of Shyama's name be remain on my forehead forever. That it is my credit that it is on me. I am blessed to be marred by Shyama's name. So that is Gopal Krishna. He has translatability. His poets do not rely on sonic effect. So therefore it is very much translatable and the effect of the poem doesn't go. This was the dominant literature of 17th, 18th, 19th century Odisha. There is a third poet, Kavi Surya Baladeva Ratha, who again belongs to southern Odisha, Ganjam. Kavi Surya introduces a new genre. He writes a lot of these Odissi songs, but his major contribution is that he writes 34 songs and he calls that set what is called Champu. Champu is said Gadya Padyamayan Kavya. So Kavya which has prose and poetry. He writes the prose in Sanskrit, he writes the poetry in English. And he makes it into 34 songs, each song for each consonant of the alphabet. So same that Chautisa model was one song with 34 stanzas. He makes it 34 songs. In these 34 songs, he does every kind of effect, every kind of literary effect, lack of literary effect, musical effect, lack of musical effect, tala, raga, chanda, whatever is possible, he includes in this. So it is like a panoramic view of entire Odia literature, Odia musical tradition, starting right from the 14th, 15th century. He uses the chanda genre, he uses the Odissi genre, he will use long songs, he will use very short songs. That is the kind of versatility that we find. And this Kavi Surya, for example, one of the champus goes. ढाले तो ढालिलु नाही ढालिलु नाही ढालिलु नाही कृपा सुधा झरी किरे So ढाले तो ढालिलु नाही कृपा सुधा झरी किरे. For the letter dha, धक्का बाजू थाई ब्रजे ललितार हृदाम बुझे करुणा अच्छी जाबली. So every line will begin with dha. Similarly, if you go for the next song, for example, if you go to the bha song, भंगी चाहा भुरु नील भुजंगी भ्रमरा जीवस भाग्य ए जनन भाग्य ए जन आखि जनन रटी सखी जाणरे भरमी न जातु मन्मथ बाणरे भुज पासी को छंदी मो गळे भिड़े पद कंज खंज धरणी तले भूमंडना भला मानुची देखो. Everything bha 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 bha. Same for all the other letters of the alphabet. That is Kavi Surya. Kavi Surya's one of the more famous songs is Sarpa Janana, a Janana in which he compares Jagannatha with a snake. So there has been some mishap in his life, and he goes to Jagannatha and he says, "The snake doesn't have feet, you don't have feet. So what is the difference between snake and you? Snake doesn't wink and you don't wink. You don't have eyelashes either. What is the difference between snake and you? And you killed the snake called Kaliya. People usually have enmity from people of the same breed. Right? If you were a human, you would have killed a human. If you were a god, you would have set up a fight with a god. Because you are a snake, therefore you have enmity with the snake. You want to be the dominant snake in the pond." So later he uses elaborate metaphors such as like ଅଛଯାବତ ଘଟେ ବଞ୍ଚାଅ ଯେ କପଟେ ମୋର ହାବୁଡୁ ଜୀବ କାହିଁ ହେ କୃପାନିଧି he Mahaprabhu. The snake when caught is kept in a ghata or a pot, and you are there in everybody's ghata or body. So what is the difference between a snake and you? So this kind of fun, and we see the same level of confidence in challenging Jagannatha as if he were a friend or something. These were the great trinity of Odissi music, led by Bhanja, followed by Vanamali, Gopala Krishna, and Kavi Surya. These are also the greatest Vagyakaras of that period. We also find other poets, not mentioning whom would be the greatest mishap of my talk, which is poets like Bhakta Das, who have written elaborate kavyas. These belong to the Kavya period, but they have become so influential that it is incorrect to omit them. Bhakta Das famously writes poems such as Krishna's Mathuragama. Again, Chanda tunes popular in every corner of Odisha. কলা করে বড় কন্হাই সঙ্গে রোহিণী সুত করন্তি মথুরা বিজয়ে দাণ্ডে দেখ সংগাত খসি পড়ুছি কি আকাশু কিয়ে গঙ্গা যমুনা ক্ষীর সঙ্গে প্রাণ শোষিলে না সগলা পুতনা. The dark-hued Krishna on a chariot along with his brother is going to Mathura. So that is the picture. This is the song, this is the usual lullaby that Odia mothers sing to their children. Another famous poet of this period is Abhimanyu Samanta Singhara, who writes a poem by the name Vidagdha Chintamani, which is an elaborate discourse. Both it narrates the story of Radha Krishna, simultaneously is distilling all the tattvas of bhakti and prema and madhurya. All that. So he famously writes, for example, very Gita Govinda like things. The ideas of the Gita Govinda are matured and reflect themselves in far finer language in the Prakrit language. The Gita Govinda was in Sanskrit. This is reflected the same thing in a very typical Odia flavor. For example, he says, Radha searching for Krishna in Viraha, and in the words of Abhimanyu, Kaliya komala dekhile komala nayana re bhuve jara jara. So she sees a Nilotpala or a dark Padma, and looking at the color of the dark Padma, and looking at the dark Megha in the sky, looking at the Tamala tree creeper with its blue flower. She is reminded of Krishna and she goes embracing. So that is the kind of Madhurya Bhakti expounded by these poets. They are not obsessed with general description of Krishna's feature or all that. They are more to deal with the deeper and profound aspects of bhakti, to be presented through the songs which will move the viewers to or the listeners to a higher realm. That is their intention. So literature is driven by that Brahma Jnana Bhakti, that thing. By this, we have more or less encapsulated until the 18th and 19th century. Later, we find other poets such as Gaura Charana Adhikari, Gaura Hari. We also find a thriving tradition of Krishna Lila. We find Radha Prema Lila, Prahalada Nataka. All the folk art forms are also developing, newer forms are popping up, newer modes of literature and narration and dialogue and stage theater drama with proper prosaic dialogue are coming up in 1850s, that period. We find poets of Odisha were very conservative in this regard. Even during the British period, they are very hesitant to accept modern modes of narration or to accept poems in which there is no rhyming. They will not accept that. To accept poems meant for recitation, they will not do that. They're sticking to the older models. So proper raga, tala, Gita Dharmi, following all the tenets of the Rasa Shastra, of the Sangita Shastra, of the Sahitya Shastra, Chanda Shastra. They're properly following all Shastric things, even as late as 1900, 10s and 20s. As of 1900, as of 1870, we find a new group popping up, and gradually people are getting exposed to Western education and they're somehow willing to depart. We will find a proper exposition of that in 1920, 30. But before that, we must come to a poet from Western Odisha who came from the Kondha tribe. According to some people, he was blind, but perhaps it is metaphorical blindness. The poet's name is Bhima Bhoi. He came from a tribal family, and according to his regard, he came across a divine figure by the name of Mahima Swami. And with the blessings of Mahima Swami, he initiates almost a new group of Hindu Dharma, which is called Mahima Dharma. He says that Mahima Dharma, there is one God, he is Nirakar, and he is in line with the old Nirakar ideologies. His lines are very striking in that they're very raw, and the music is also very earthy in that sense. It is music that can be sung by the common person. So one of the lines of Bhima Bhoi, which is there in the parliament, is that Mo jivana pache narke padithau, jagata udharo. Let my life rot in hell, but let the world be redeemed. If that is the cost for the world to be redeemed, let me be in hell. And he also uses that esoteric, difficult to understand, cryptic language, mystic language of earlier. The counterpart of which in northern India would be the poems of Kabir. And in Odisha, of course, we have the Pancha Sakha and the Charya Gitas. We have a living tradition of that. The point being that this cryptic Brahmagyana yogic stream continues to survive in India as late as 1910s and 20s, and even now it survives people living in caves and doing these elaborate yogic chakra sadhanas. That was Bhima Bhoi. After this, we enter the modern phase. Modern Odia poetry, the first thing it breaks away is from Amitrakshara. So with influence from Western poetry, they say that rhyming is no longer essential. We only want something that sounds like a meter, but doesn't essentially have rhyming endings, which was a compulsory thing for the Kshudra Gitas earlier written. The pioneers of this movement are Kabibara Radhanath Rai. So he writes first poems of this genre. The interesting thing is, even when he writes things of this genre, he sticks to the tunes of the older Chanda genre, because he has not yet made up his mind to switch to proper recitation. Later, recitation also develops. Radhanath Rai translates, or rather transcreates, the Greek epics into Odia language, but using the same Chanda model, very interestingly. And Odia people are exposed to these stories of Greek mythology for the first time. It catches on for some period. We also have in this period Bhakta Kavi Madhusudan Rao, who writes the first Odia primer by the name of Varnabodha. He takes inspiration from the Chattasalis or the earlier the schools what were there. Whatever the methodology or teaching pedagogy was there, he takes inspiration from that. For example, early Odia education, some 15th century or something, the first songs they would teach you would be simple metrical structure with simple words. Krishna Katha Bhali Gopi Sakala Guna Sumari Huanti Bikala. This is how they would teach. Gradually, they would build up elaborate metrical and literary structures. So Madhusudan Rao takes inspiration from that, and he makes simple poems, small couplets of poems, and he keeps that for each letter. For example, the letter is Ko. He will make a small poem in this book he called Bodha. And this Bodha was published sometime in the late part of the 19th century, and it caught on like wildfire because it was very simple. And he organized words like cow, gai, bato, bhato, chaso. This was how he codified it, using something from old methodology, using something from his own, and inspiration from Western teaching methods also. So this was the first primer and proper grammar, and every generation of Odias from then has grown up memorizing these same poems or words in that same order. And for the first time, the letters and the script and everything being properly printed and letter, probably first letters being minted in that press also. As for the printing methodology, that was introduced like in every other part of India by the missionaries for the translation of Bible and for demeaning Hindu faith and targeting Jagannatha greatly. That is something that doesn't come into the greater. It is not of relevance in Odia literature, but the missionaries invented their own weird take on Odia language without understanding properly the grammar. They invented a very verbose, high sounding language, which is to this date known as Padri. Odia is a word which we use for something that sounds very verbose and hi-fi, but actually has nothing to mean. That we call Padri Odia even today. So this is the period until 1900s and post 1900s also. There was another poem from Western Odisha, from Sambalpur, from the weaving classes by the name of Gangadhara Meher. He brought modernness and he interpreted Prakriti somehow in the light of Kalidas and all. Instead of focusing on the epics, he also did focus on the epics, but he shifted his focus towards topics that are more universal, like describing the beauty of the seasons, things like that. He also notably stuck to the older Chanda genre of singing. So we find this conservative tendency. And like Sir was mentioning, we find independence literature as with every other place. These poets also wrote Jatiya literature. Some of them converted to Christianity but did not give up on Jagannatha. So he said the poems of that period, specifically in light of Odia nationalism, refer to that all you Odia people raise your arms and Daka Trahi Jagannatha. Call upon Jagannatha to save you. And this is coming from the pen of a person who is allegedly converted to Christianity, but is willing to unite Odia people. So again, Jagannatha becomes the primary figure for Odia nationalism as well. And very importantly, when the Britishers tried to take over the Puri temple and interfere in the matters of the administration, overthrowing the young prince and putting the king to Andaman Nicobar prison and all that, there was a huge outbreak of opposition. So much so that even in London there was opposition. The British government had to back up and they had to allow for the Puri temple. They had also imposed that they were willing to stop the temple and to test whether God is really there and everything. All of that clashed. So that also provided incentive to Odia nationalism, because the more these people tried to alienate people, the more people identified themselves with Jagannatha. And as we know, the early movements of allowing all tribes into the Puri temple, untouchables into the Puri temple, Brahmins and Chandalas sitting together and eating, all these customs of the Puri temple, Jagannatha coming out himself, the main deity being allowed to be touched by people from all castes in the belief that the deity will not be polluted, rather the person will be purified by touching the deity. All these beliefs find more and more emphasis in literature of that period. Even nationalistic literature was written to Odissi tunes, surprisingly. For example, we find Krishna songs, Odissi songs by the same poet Bonamari Dasa. The original tune in Raga Mishra Mukhari is Kahi gole muroli puka Juvati rasiya kami ronka. This is the Odissi tune. Now in 1930s, 40s, there were gramophone records being made. So gramophone records these people issued. Poets of that period wrote. When Simon Commission came, Simon report lekha Haji gola hela bajare bika. So even nationalistic songs are being modeled on Odissi. That is how popular the musical sentiment is in Indian literature. And post 1940s, 50s, we find outbreak of, we find primarily leftist literature we find coming up, talking for the people, which is led by people such as Karingi Panigrahi, importantly. We find romanticism movement coming in, led by people like Maidhar Mansingh. We find other movements such as the Anna movement coming up, and other small scale movements coming up, which are each having their own agenda and all. Important thing to mention is also in that 1870, 80 until this 1950-60 period, newspapers, newspaper editorials and journalists played a major role. For example, Gauri Shankar Rai, they played a major role in shaping public sentiment, in including debates among people, such as in that period, ancient Odia Kavyas were being published for the first time. They were seeing the light of the press for the first time. So there was huge debate on 17th century poet Upendra Bhanja. Should Bhanja be called a great poet? Because he's dealing with the erotic arts openly, just as we find in Kalidasa or in Sanskrit poetry or in the old Indian temples. So there was widespread clash between the Western outlook, Western influence to the people who were educated in that Victorian mindset, and people from the old school Pandits who, for them, it was a matter of fact, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. So like that, there was a clash, and journals and newspaper editors played a major role. So one newspaper was for and one was against. There was a wide clash for decades altogether. Public sentiment emerged out of that. So these were important movements in shaping the identity of literature of that period, and whether people wanted to be associated or disassociated for that. Gladly, the traditional outlook or the Indic outlook ruled the scenario and was what remained. Gladly, people were mature enough not to lean towards the other thing, which was that these poets were foolish and didn't know anything, and they were obscene, and this just gradual dismissal of everything that is Indian and comes from Indian parampara. That was until the 1980s, 90s, and 1930s, 40s. We also found movements by people such as Professor Arta Vallabh Mahanti, collection movements to collect palm leaf manuscripts and to publish more and more palm leaf manuscripts, in which period huge number of palm leaf manuscripts of 14th, 15th century, even 13th century, all that was prepared. Odia phonetic charts were prepared, lipi or script was studied, linguistics was studied. All this mess that was created during 1860, 70, one major mess that was created was Odisha was divided into two parts under Madras presidency and Bengal presidency. So there were, all the ruling class were either from Bengal or Madras. So they didn't, people from Madras, of course, had no idea about Odisha. People from Bengal had some idea about Odisha. Of them, some people were willing to help the Odias. They collected things and established radio station at Cuttack and all that. Some people were not. Some people were bent upon destroying the Odia language and introducing Bengali as the main language from the Sarkari courts. As we know, before that, in the Mughal rule and all, Persian was the court language. So that was already a major hit on the local rural languages. Devadasi cult and all the local cults were highly discouraged. Normal person cannot understand anything that is going on courts because it is all going in Persian. Only people who are specially skilled can understand. Now, what happens in Bengal presidency? Everything is written in English or Bengal. And in Madras presidency, they are writing everything in Telugu. So again, the same thing is happening. Odia people are unable to understand. In this part, the coastal Odisha, which was the dominant part of the entire state now. So we find that even to the British officials, Bengali officers who were appointed as school teachers everywhere did not want to learn the Odia language to teach Odia people. So they said that this Odia language doesn't have a future. Therefore, let us do away with this Odia language. Now, Bengali is the modern language because Britishers and all were acquainted with it. It is the language of trade. It is the language of business. Therefore, Odia people, it will do good to them to dispose this Odia language and learn Bengali language. That was a movement that went to the higher ranks of British officials until it was dismissed by one John Beams, who was a linguist himself and has written elaborate linguistic studies on Indian languages. He dismissed it by saying that Odia is the elder sister of the eastern branch of languages and retains older features. So that is what the language has had to gone through politically. It has had to face a lot of flack. Today that Odia is recognized as a classical language and is the medium of courts has happened after many centuries of utter lack of any respect given to the language. This brings a very different kind of political nationalistic angle to the Odia language as compared to, say, Bengal, where the language itself was the primary medium for a huge time. So that's what I believe. We've lost something in the early period when Odia was ignored. Perhaps if that period manuscripts were collected, we could have got a lot. But whatever, it has contributed positively to the nationalistic movement.
Thank you,
That was
Triti. It was excellent coverage right from the classical period up to the modern period. The entire Odia literature has been introduced. I noticed that the in charge of our director of Center for Bharatiya Languages, Shri Megh Kalyan Sundaramji, is in the audience. It is Center for Bharatiya Languages, under the auspices of which this talk is being conducted. I request Srinivas Garu to promote Meghji as a panelist. Srinivas Garu, please promote Meghji as a panelist. Koti Garu or Srinivas Garu?
Yes, sir. Yes. It's done, sir.
Yeah. So, Shri Meghji, please switch on your video.
Yeah, namaste. Namaste, Pratik. Namaste, Nagraj-ji. Pratik, that was a wonderful overview. Thank you so much. I didn't know a lot of this, what you shared today. And I think you've given not just a chronological, but also a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary perspective on literature, which is very fascinating. I would like to raise a question, if that's okay. In English, what might be one or two books you would suggest to the audience if they want to dive deeper, to understand Odia literature? Even one book, I think that would be a good suggestion or a good takeaway for the audience. Thank you.
I would suggest 2 or 3 books from each period. As for the early Charya Gitis, which are common to all three, Ahamiya, Bangla and Odia streams, depending on songs, there are proper translations and everything is available. That is one of the earliest things. Later, if we come to the classical period, 15th century or so, 15th century, we find the Odia Bhagavata of Atibadi Jagannath Das, that is even today recited in every village by everybody from every possible economical or social class. So readings from the Odia Bhagavata have been translated, selections. That is something people must go through because it's a very, in fact, 2 days ago, it was Bhagavata Janma was celebrated in Odisha. So for a book, we
I
have a
see.
birthday that is celebrated across the state. I don't think there is
Wonderful.
another counterpart to that. And 18th century selections of Upendra Bhanjar's Vaidehisha Bidasa and Banamadi's poetry and Gopalakrishna and Kavi Suja's poetry have been translated. There are anthologies that serve well. As for post-modern and modern, I would suggest Fakir Mohan Senapati's 6 Acres and a Third, which is the first, one of the earliest Odia novels, talks about economical scenario in a very typical colloquial Odia language along with classical language. So 6 Acres and a Third is what the translation is called.
Great. Thank you. Nagraji, I have not turned on the video because I am on my phone network. There's a power failure. So my modem is not working. So I would have lost the audio if the video had gone. So that's why I have not turned on the
Thank
video.
you for joining.
Thank you, Pratik.
Thank you for joining Sri Meghji. For your question about an English introduction to Odia literature, Central Sahitya Academy has published histories of various Indian literatures. It has published the history of Odia literature also. And also there are volumes under Panikkar, Professor Panikkar, when he was in charge of Central Sahitya Academy, a volume called Medieval Indian Literature was published. And that volume has coverage of almost all the major Indian literatures. That includes Odia literature also. And there are smaller volumes, briefer volumes of history of Odia literature also published by private agencies from Bhubaneswar and Cuttack. But these are very brief. So they are very short, some 30-40 pages introductions also were published. So these will first give you a basic introduction of Odia.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I did a little bit of literature survey, but I thought it was a good question to ask also for the audience in with us today, so that if they want to kind of dive deeper into what Pratik has exposed us to, then that opportunity would be
not just
there.
Odia literature, for all the Indian regional literatures. One good work that has come from these government bodies is from both Central Sahitya Academy and also National Book Trust. National Book Trust also participated in a very big way in the form of translations of some very important works from Indian regional languages into English and other languages also. Actually, there are multiple such translations. There are translations of each of these into each of other languages also by National Book Trust.
Right.
So all these will also help people to know about Odia literature through English. Pratik, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say that the National Sahitya Academy commissioned that history of Odia literature sometime in the 80s or 90s, I think. The book was authored by a modern poet whom I will not name, but that book included certain disparaging leftist remarks towards the earlier poets, which was therefore met with a huge controversy in Odisha, and so much so that the book was withdrawn by the Sahitya Academy. The state of scholarship is such that the thing is, we have very little translation of primary sources, which is yet to be done. We have hardly selection. So primary works must be properly translated, like suppose the older Greek works are properly translated and presented bilingual editions. That is something pending for all of the Indian languages.
Pratik, I would, since you mentioned this, and I'm sorry to interject over here, but we would be very happy to hear from you on suggestions on who can actually translate this. And I am happy to connect with them further. If it's you, great. If it's not you, but you think somebody else can do it, we would be very keen to explore the possibility of bringing that out in a proper manner, in a way that works mutually for Indica as well as for the translator involved. So I'd be happy to explore that further after this conversation with you separately. And thank you for bringing that up. Yeah,
there are a few questions and comments in the question and answer box. One question is, what was the script when Charyapada was being written?
The Charya manuscripts have been found in certain belts of Nepal. So they are copies of copies. So we can't say that that was the original script. Regardless of that, the script in the Charya manuscript, it shows affinity with letters of modern Odia. It shows some letter shows more affinity with Bengali. Other letter shows more affinity with Odia. It's like that. It's like remnants of something have survived in various parts. We find the local Purvi Nagari script in inscriptions of Odisha, that 12th, 14th period, which is very angular and has a Shirorekha also. Later, we find that curved script coming due to increasing usage of palm leaf manuscripts, or perhaps it always existed as a separate stream, because the usage of palm leaf is also not something very modern.
There is a question about Brahmanda Tattva of Pancha Sakha. I want to tell the audience that this is such a brief introduction, please, to talk about a particular work and Brahmanda Tattva. We will definitely request Prateek to come again and talk about such specific topics in detail. And there is a comment by Ranjan Joshi who is suggesting that Sarala Mahabharata is a good introduction to Odia Mahabharata. And this is she has given the online link, which is saralamahabharata.org. Ranjan, she or he, probably he, is giving a link to saralamahabharata.org as the link for this. And so we are very happy that there is a lot of interest in the Odia literature, and Center for Bharatiya Languages, which Meghaji is leading, is going to come up with more such talks on other Bharatiya languages also, and is going to introduce the audience towards an Indic perspective of Bharatiya languages. And Prateek ji is going to be associated with our Bharatiya Languages Center in future also. He is going to contribute to not just translations, but also an Indic perspective of classical Odia literature, and how decolonization happened during the modern period of Odia literature also. All such aspects, Prateek ji will continue to help us, I'm sure. Thank you, Prateek ji, for joining us. Actually, it gives such a great hope to people like me that such youngsters are participating in such intense, deep, and wide study of regional Indian literatures. It's a great promise for our future. Prateek is a promise for the next 80 years, at least, of Indic studies in Odia literature. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'd like to add that this talk wouldn't have happened had it not been for Dr. Paturi's spotting of Prateek and suggesting, and they've also worked earlier in the past. And I hope the symposium, which Dr. Paturi is in conversation with Prateek on specific to Odia literature, will also take shape in a nice way. Thanks so much, Prateek. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, our founder, Harikiran Vadlamani Garu, for suggesting this program. And thanks to all the audience who stayed continuously for such a long time during this Sunday evening. It is very rare. Usually people leave in the middle of the talk, but they stayed for the entire talk. And as usual, thanks to our event helping officers, Srinivas Garu and Koti Garu, who have been working behind the screens for all this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.